Tengen had retired from being a Hashira after the battle in the entertainment district where he lost his left arm and left eye. He was now just training the new Demon Slayer Corps members during the Hashira training. After a long day of training, and after that, everyone had gone to bed for the night, Tengen went outside to the cliffside and sat himself on a log looking up at the stars. His mind was racing and he couldn't sleep. He let out a deep sigh as he leaned back, stretching his tired legs, and looked up at the night full of stars in the sky above him. Then he heard footsteps approaching behind him. But he didn't have to look back to know it was her. He was surprised she of all people was up at this hour as he watched the stars with a bored look on his face. "Can't sleep?" Tengen asked with his signature confident tone, with a sly smirk as he turned his head around to look at her. Tengen chuckled as he patted the empty spot next to him on the log he was sitting on. "Come sit with me," he said. He watched as she awkwardly sat down next to him, and he turned his attention back to the stars above them. The silence of the night was oddly relaxing as he let out a deep exhale. Tengen let out another deep exhale as he glanced over at her. He could see her looking up at the stars as well. He thought it was cute how, even in the middle of the night, she still looked adorable. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" he asked, still looking at her, his heart starting to beat a bit faster as he stared at her beauty in the night. Tengen smiled as nodded his head. "Yeah, a really nice night," he said before another moment of silence followed. He could hear her breathing next to him, and Tengen let out a deep exhale as he leaned back, resting his hand next to her. He could feel his hand brushing up against hers on the log, and he looked down as he saw them next to each other. He could feel his stomach starting to flutter even more now when he saw how close his hand next to hers. How easy it would be to just reach even further and hold her hand in his. Tengen was looking back at her. His heart was starting to beat even faster as their eyes met, and he felt his breath slowly get caught in his throat as she stared at him silently. He let out another deep exhale before he let his hand gently and tentatively reached over to hers. He hesitantly touched his hand with hers as he wrapped his fingers tenderly around hers. Her hand felt so soft and delicate against his, which was rough and hard from years of training. He looked down at their hands together, savoring the moment as his heart continued to thump faster in his chest. He continued to hold her hand in his, gently rubbing his thumb against the back of her hand as he continued to stare at her. He could feel her pulse from her wrist, where their hands were connected, and he knew hers must be beating just as fast as his. As she interlocked their fingers together, Tengen felt his heart flutter again as he looked down at their hands holding each other. His whole skin felt tingly and warm where their hands were connected as he looked back up at her and saw her smiling at him as he smiled lovingly back at her. He gently gave her hand a small squeeze before he spoke again. He started to say before he suddenly cut himself off as he felt his throat get dry again. He swallowed nervously, gathering the courage to continue talking, but before he could say anything else, he let out a soft sigh as he squeezed her hand again. It was now or never. He needed to tell her how he felt. I have something to tell you," he said, looking her directly in the eyes as his heart thumped in his chest anxiously. Tengen's hand started to slightly sweat as he held her hand tighter in his. He was nervous. More nervous than he was facing Upper Moon 6, but he had to say it anyway since it would plague his mind if he didn't. He swallowed again before taking a deep breath, trying to calm his heart down and slow his breathing as he spoke again. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you for a while now," he said as he spoke in a gentle and tender tone, looking at her and their hands still intertwined together. Tengen was taken aback and his heart skipped a beat when she replied in that manner. He stared at her as she spoke. His throat had gone completely dry and he could only give a slight nod as a sign for her to continue. Tengen let out a deep exhale before he took a moment to gather his thoughts again, as he looked at her, still holding her hand. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he was struggling to find the words to say to her, so he decided to just simply say it. "I've fallen in love with you," he managed to mutter out bluntly. Tengen felt his heart stop, and his breath got caught in his throat as he felt her fingers gently brush against his cheek. He was speechless for a moment before he spoke again. "I don't know exactly when. It was sometime during our time fighting the entertainment district together," he said as he spoke truthfully while looking back at her. "And I've wanted to tell you since then, but I was scared because I didn't know if you felt the same." Tengen let out a slight chuckle before he continued. "I know it's a bit cheesy, but I can't help but feel this way about you. I can't stop thinking about you. You consume my thoughts every day," he said as he gently took his free hand and caressed the top of her hand that was still on his cheek. Tengen smiled gently as he spoke again. "I've never met anyone like you, and I never will. You're a one-of-a-kind, and you've stolen my heart the moment I met you," he said as he looked into her eyes again. His heart was beating so hard against his chest he thought it might explode. Tengen felt a wave of relief wash over him as he heard her words. He was so thankful she felt the same way about him. He gently took the hand that was on his cheek to his mouth and gave her palm a gentle kiss. Tengen smiled as he listened to her, and he remembered that moment vividly. Feeling her gentle touch on his bare chest, it made his cheeks heat up a bit. "Yeah, I could never forget that. You saved my life that day, and you stole my heart with your kindness and beauty," he said as he smiled gently again as he gazed into her eyes. He then chuckled lightly as he spoke again. "I knew after that moment my heart would be forever lost to you," he said, gently interlocking their fingers together again and rubbing the back of her hand with his calloused thumb. Tengen was slightly taken off guard by her boldness, but at the moment he was absolutely ecstatic. He gently leaned down so he was at a lower level to her, and he felt his heart beat even faster as their faces got closer together. Then he felt her soft lips press against his, and it felt like fireworks going off in his head as he closed his eyes and kissed her softly back. He felt her lips against his, so soft and tender, and he savored every second of it. He could taste her on his lips, and it sent a wave of desire rushing through him. He brought his hand up to the back of her head and tangled his fingers in her hair as he deepened the kiss slightly, pulling her closer to him. Tengen continued to kiss her, feeling more and more desperate the longer it went on as he held her tight in his arms. He didn't want it to end, so he kept kissing her deeply, his heart racing in his chest as he lost himself in the moment and in her.
He could feel her body pressed against his own, her soft skin against his rough bare chest as he pulled her onto his lap. He wrapped his arms around her waist, keeping her secure in his embrace, as he continued to kiss her passionately. After a few moments, Tengen reluctantly pulled away slightly to catch his breath, his heart beating faster than ever before as he looked at her with a mixture of desire and affection. "You have no idea how long I've been wanting to do that," he whispered, his voice raspy and low.
He smiled and looked into her eyes as he gently caressed her cheek. "I love you so much," he said. The words coming out of his mouth felt so natural and right as he looked at her with all of his love and adoration. Tengen chuckled as he heard the way she said his name. He loved the way it sounded coming from her. He gently grabbed her chin and leaned down close to her, his lips mere inches away from hers again. "Please call me Tengen," he whispered, his breath hot against her mouth as he spoke. He smirked and his heart skipped a beat as he heard her whisper his name. "Say it again." Tengen felt a shiver run down his spine as he heard his name from her lips again. He was addicted to the way it sounded when she said it. He smiled and then leaned in to kiss her again, his passion and desire for her consuming him as his tongue gently traced along her lower lip. He held her tight against him, pulling her even closer as their bodies pressed together. His hands roamed over her body, tracing the shape of her curves and feeling the softness of her skin. He wanted to touch every part of her, worship her with all of his being. His tongue explored the inside of her mouth as he kissed her deeply, tasting her, and letting her taste him in return. He could feel his own desire growing stronger with every passing second, and he knew he would never get enough of her. He pulled back slightly again, looking at her with dilated pupils and a look of pure hunger for her on his face. "I want you," he whispered hoarsely, his voice laced with need as he looked at her desperately.